I would literally go to war for that child. If you dare to hurt her, I'm gonna fight you, I'm gonna find you, I'm gonna... Hello everyone, welcome back to my account, welcome back to Better Off Read. Thank you so much for being here. If you're new here, which you probably are, please consider subscribing because I intend to post a lot more bookish content in the future. It is that time of the month again, and I do realize that that makes it sound like I'm talking about that time of the month for women, but that's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is that it's the time of the month where bookish people gather to talk about all the books they finished reading that month. This is going to be my first ever monthly wrap-up, and we're going to talk about all the books I finished reading in April. I finished reading 8 books in April, and I apologize in advance. I know that YouTube is a very visual place, but I don't have a lot of the physical copies from the books that I read. This month, my library and Libby were my best friends. I borrowed so many books from the library. I borrowed so many ebooks and audiobooks, and that's pretty much all I read this month. I only have 1 physical copy of the books that I read, which is okay. As long as we're reading, we're doing just fine. I thought I just heard something. Well, at least I have the camera on, right? But let's just get started. The first book I finished reading in April was Lost in the Neverwoods by Aiden Thomas. It truly feels like I read this book like a billion years ago because I read it at the very beginning of April. But essentially, this is a Peter Pan retelling, and I found it to be a quite dark Peter Pan retelling. In this story, we follow Wendy after both her brothers went missing in the woods and no one really knows what happened to them. It has been years since they've gone missing, but at this point the whole town assumes that they have passed away. Wendy feels a lot of guilt because she was with them when they went missing and she cannot remember what happened to them. No matter how hard she tries, and she does try a lot, she cannot remember what happened. Whenever she thinks about the time in which they were all missing, because what I forgot to mention is that she went missing with her brothers, but then she was the only one that returned. Her brothers never showed up again. And she feels a lot of guilt because she was the only one that came back. But Wendy has this thing where she is obsessed with Peter Pan because her mom used to tell her Peter Pan stories. We sort of follow this magical realism sort of world where Peter Pan is a story, but Peter Pan also exists, if that makes sense. And every now and again, she'll find herself drawing pictures and she doesn't know how she's drawing those pictures, and it's always of the woods or of a boy that looks a lot like Peter Pan. And then one day she's driving her car and she accidentally runs into someone, and what do you know? It's Peter Pan, and he's looking for his shadow. His shadow ran away, and his shadow is this dark being, and he asks that Wendy helps him find his shadow. That's all I'm gonna say. The story is really good. Really dark, especially for Aiden Thomas. I was not expecting the story to be as dark as it was. I did feel like this book could have been like maybe 70 pages shorter because it felt like the story dragged on for a little bit too long. It's probably my least favorite Aiden Thomas book that I've read. This one didn't feel like their style. It just didn't hit the same way for me. I did like it, I did not love it, and usually I end up loving Aiden Thomas' book. It did, however, leave me with a major crush on Peter Pan, which I don't think I ever had. I don't know, even though in my head Peter Pan was always cute, I never felt like I had a crush on him until this book, and now I have a crush on him. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez. This was so good. This is a collection of short stories, and they all have like a little bit of horror and a little bit of magical realism in them. It was so good. This was my first Mariana Enriquez book, and I've heard a lot about this author in the past. Mariana Enriquez is Argentinian, I'm pretty sure, so this book is translated. I am Brazilian, and I feel like whenever I am listening to any Latino horror story, it just hits differently, okay? Because I feel like it's almost as if I'm seeing my grandma telling me the story, and all of the things that I used to be afraid of when I was a kid just come to life. And with this book, it was no different. The audiobook narration was perfection. It was so good to the point that sometimes I honestly felt like the narrator was changing. And I even double checked to see if there was only one narrator or if there were multiple, because they were so good at changing their intonation, at changing the tone of voice when they were delivering the story. The story that stayed the most with me, I cannot remember the name, but it's about children and it's about Barcelona. The Ghosts of Children in Barcelona. It's all I'm gonna say. That story creeped me out, but it really stayed with me. I really enjoyed listening to this book, and I honestly feel like I'm going to be reading a lot more Mariana Enriquez in the future. Next, I read my first ever book with my book club. I have a book club on Fabo, which if you want to join, I'm going to link it down below. And April was our first month reading a book together, and we read I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself by Marisa. I think this book was my favorite read of the month. I had high expectations going into it because the plot just seemed so interesting, and it did not disappoint. This is essentially a dystopian novel about this American society where instead of sending people to prison and incarcerating them, people are given a second shadow, and this shadow just follows them around everywhere. So you have the shadow that you were born with, but you also have a shadow that just walks around with you, no matter where you go. And this is just like a public reminder that you did something that you should be ashamed of, that you did something that wasn't morally right, but the way in which society decides what's right or wrong, it's quite messed up. There's no place for misunderstanding, and it pretty much just highlights how messed up the justice system is and how shameful it is for the people that have a shadow to live their lives, and how difficult it is for them to have a normal life because everything that they do is determined by their shadow. From going to the grocery store, they have a set amount of days in which they can go, a set amount of hours in which they can go, where they can't get the freshest food. And everything that they do, they're constantly watched by the government. Even in their homes, they have cameras just because they maybe committed a crime years ago that wasn't even that bad. You know, it's so interesting. And essentially, we're following this main character, and she has a shadow. We follow her as she is bringing her newborn child into her house after her partner just died during childbirth, so she has to navigate the grief of losing the love of her life with also having to raise this child by herself. But not only that, her child has been given a shadow as well. So she has to raise this baby that she knows society is going to give absolutely hell for because she also has a shadow. And the commentary in this book is so incredible. Her kid, Chris's kid, I would literally go to war for that child. If you dare to hurt her, I'm gonna fight you, I'm gonna find you, I'm gonna destroy your house. I don't know. But it was so good. I felt like it was a very easy book to read. The narrator is really funny. She's very sarcastic. The commentary about the way in which we live our lives was very on point. Her kids' comments were just so funny. I really enjoyed this book. I felt like it was very touching. It was the right amount of sarcastic, but also deep. It just did everything right for me. I felt like I didn't really have any major criticism to do for this book. I felt like the characters felt very believable in my opinion, and it just felt like a story that is going to stay with me for a long time and not something that I read and just move on from. I felt like after I put it down and after I finished, I was often thinking about the characters and thinking about their journey. If you're into social commentary, if you're into books with children as characters who have a personality, who have something to say about the world, read this one. It will not disappoint. Next, I listened to the audiobook of White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson. I truly feel like the best way to read a Tiffany D. Jackson book is through audio. The narrators that they pick for her books are just so good. They're able to really capture the atmosphere of the story, the vibes. The tone of the narrator is just so incredibly good. This was also for a long time the only Tiffany D. Jackson book I had not read just yet. So now I have read all of her books and I just need to sit and wait for 2024, which is when I believe she's publishing another one. She is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, YA thriller author out there. She's so good at what she does. Her stories are so compelling. It's always kind of creepy, but also the commentary that she always has something to say, something that is worth saying and something that people need to listen to. I love her stories. White Smoke is a story about a family that has just moved into another town. A classic setup for a horror story. They have just moved in and they move into this neighborhood that is really, really strange. Like when they are driving around, they realize that a lot of the houses are burnt in the neighborhood and they're like, what the hell? Like no one lives here. Like what are we doing here? But their mom has been invited to take part in this program where pretty much she gets the housing for free, right? Which should be a red flag on its own. And they move into this house, which is the only house in the neighborhood that's not burnt down. And weird things start happening. This house seems kind of haunted, but our main character, who is mainly the perspective that we get from in the story, she has gone through some stuff in life and her family doesn't necessarily trust her anymore. So when she's trying to be like, hey, like this is going on, I'm really freaked out, people are like, oh, you're spiraling again. Like we can't trust what you're saying. So it's really good. The audiobook had me so scared. This was really good. I liked the ending, but I didn't love the ending of the story. I liked the message that Tiffany D. Jackson was trying to send with the story, but I don't love how the story wrapped up, if I was being completely honest. But even though it's not my favorite by the author, it was still very enjoyable. It went by so fast. I really wanted to know what was going to happen next, which I feel like is always what happens with her books. And I enjoyed it, didn't love it, but would recommend. Next, I read a middle grade book. I read Nick Blake and the Remarkables by Angie Thomas. Angie Thomas is one of those authors that whatever she writes, I don't know what happens. Whenever I'm reading one of her books, I cannot not finish it within like 2 days. Her writing, the way that she structures her stories, I don't know what she does. It's like some magic. But whenever I'm reading her books, I feel so immersed that I just need to finish it. And this one was a very different style of Angie Thomas. I don't think she's ever written a fantasy book before. I'm pretty sure I've read all of her books, and I don't think she's ever written a fantasy. I could be wrong, but the ones that I've read were not fantasy. This one was really lovely. It's a story about this young girl who is a remarkable, which essentially means that she has powers that unremarkables, just normal humans like us, do not possess. She lives with her father, and for some reason they live in the unremarkable world. Her father never really tells her why. He just tells her that they cannot be in the remarkable world. We don't know why. Essentially, she finds herself in a mess where her father is taken by officials of the remarkable world. And essentially, Nick has to find this weapon that she didn't even know existed in the first place. She has no idea where this weapon is. And if she doesn't find this weapon, her father is going to prison for a crime he did not commit. My battery just died, so I am sorry if we're not exactly where we were before. I tried my best to not move the camera when I was changing the battery, but I don't know if I did a good job at that. But what I think I was saying is that Nick finds herself in this situation, and she's the only one that can essentially save her father from this unfair imprisonment. The world that Angie Thomas created is so immersive. It's so interesting. I fell completely in love with Nick and with the other characters in the story as well. I honestly think this is a great book to read if you are feeling a little bit nostalgic for magical institutions, but you don't really want to support that one that should not be named. Of course, it is a middle grade, so as adult readers, the book is predictable. You feel like you can figure out what's going to happen, but that's because we are not the audience for this book. But I also don't think that makes a book any less enjoyable. I felt like it was a very fun one to read, a great palate cleanser if you're reading a lot of heavy books and you want to read something that is a little bit lighter, a little bit faster paced, a little bit easier to read. A great one to go with. The two next books are two books that I included on my reading vlog, which was my first ever video that I posted to this account, and the first one is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. I adored this book. This is a story about an older woman who has gone through a lot of things in her life. She has lost her partner to cancer. Her son has been missing for many, many years, and at this point is considered to have passed away. He's considered to be dead. For years, it was just too hard for her to try to connect with other people, because connecting to people meant that you were also potentially going to lose them, and she didn't feel like she could bear any more loss than she had already gone through. So she really shut herself down. She loves her job. Her job is to clean an aquarium at night. She is the main cleaner of the aquarium. She takes a lot of pride in her work. She's very strict about the way that she does things. And there is this octopus that lives in the aquarium as well, called Marcellus. And as the readers, we get Marcella's perspective on Tova, which is the main character, and on her story and on her journey. And it's just so lovely. At one point, we are introduced to another character who I don't want to say too much about because I don't want to give anything away, but he does play an important part in this plot. They're all characters that you fall in love with, and you just want them to be okay. You just want them to be happy. You just want the absolutely best to happen to them. The audiobook is fantastic as well because you have multiple narrators. I feel like you have 3 different narrators, one for Tova, one for the octopus, and one for the other main character in the story. They all do a phenomenal job, and it's just a very sweet story. It's very sweet to see everything coming together, and it's very wholesome, and I love those characters. I want what's best for them wherever they are in life, and I highly recommend this one. It was probably my second favorite after I keep my exoskeletons to myself. Next, I read Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones, which is the sequel to My Heart is a Chainsaw, which is this horror series following this young girl called Jade, who is extremely traumatized in life. She has gone through a lot for a young girl, and the only way that she has found to cope with what she's been through is through watching horror movies, and she becomes very obsessed with slashers. And she is so obsessed with slashers that she is convinced that like her town is the perfect town for a slasher psycho to take place. And then this one girl moves into her hometown, and Jade is like, this girl that just moved in, she is the perfect final girl. And after that, she starts sort of like spiraling, being like, it's gonna happen. I am calling it. The slasher cycle is going to begin. And then killings start happening. But you don't know whether or not it's a slasher cycle or if Jade is kind of like in her head about it. It's really good. The first book takes a little bit of time to take off. It also takes a little bit of time to get used to the author's writing style because we are following the inside of a teenager's head, so it can be quite chaotic at times, but I felt like once you get used to the story, it becomes extremely immersive, extremely interesting. The second book is a lot easier to get through because it's a lot faster. The pacing of the story is just go, 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 go from the get-go. We do have a lot of new characters that are introduced, and we're jumping from POV to POV. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to figure out how that POV plays a part in the story. But nonetheless, I found it extremely enjoyable. I'm going to be reading the third one, which I believe exists. I believe is going to come out sometime in the future. I'm definitely going to finish the series. I really enjoy it. I enjoy the characters. I enjoy the gore a little bit. And yeah, if you are a fan of horror, if you are a fan of slashers, definitely check this one out, but know that this one does have a little bit of magical realism in it. The last book that I read was This Time Tomorrow by Emma Straub, which I kind of got on a whim. I didn't have an audiobook to listen to because I was done with Remarkably Bright Creatures, so I was scrolling through Libby and they had it available and it sounded interesting, so I decided to listen to it, and I really enjoyed it. This is a story about a young woman who lives quite a normal life. She has a job, she has a boyfriend, she has friends. Like, there's nothing abnormal about her life, but she's also not necessarily happy in her life. The one thing that's really hard for her at the moment is that her father is in the hospital. He's extremely sick, and she feels like she's getting ready for her father's passing. However, on this really weird night on her 40th birthday, she finds herself going back in time, and she wakes up as a 16-year-old girl. And in her mind, she's like, well, I know what's gonna happen to my father, so what if I try to save him and stop him from having the faith that I know he's going to have in the future? So that's what she tries to do. And she tries to do this over and over and over again. She goes back in the past, tries to tweak some things, tries to change things every now and again. And she's just trying to essentially save her father's life and save herself from going through the loss of her father at a young age, because he's still like 70 something. I feel like if you liked The Midnight Library, you're gonna like this one. I didn't personally like The Midnight Library, but I liked this one a lot better. I felt like the way in which the author approached the different possibilities for her future were way better. There was a lot more accountability in terms of how the character approached the future and the past. The one thing that I will say was that there was one scene in this book that made me feel so uncomfortable that I cannot decide whether I feel like that scene was right or wrong. If you read this book, I have a feeling you probably know what I'm referring to. And that was my only issue with the book. Aside from that, I really liked the way that it approached father-daughter relationships. I felt like it was extremely emotional, extremely touching, and it just really made me appreciate my dad, and it really made me feel like I want to know more about my dad, and I want to know more about the things that he has been through. And not just my dad, with all of my family, because it really makes you realize that as you are aging, your family is aging with you, and they are not going to be there forever, just like you are not going to be here forever. So the time that you have with them is the now, and the time to make those memories and to really get to know them if you want to. Of course, I'm not saying that everyone needs to have a great relationship with their family, but if you want to, and if that's something that is important to you, whether that is with family or with friends, all that we have is the now. And that book really made that hit home for me, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I felt like it was really easy to read. The writing flows really well. Overall, I really enjoyed it, even though there was that one scene where I was like, oh, that was weird. But aside from that, this book was an almost 5-star read for me. So those were all of the books that I finished reading in April. I am quite happy with this month. I feel like I wasn't expecting to read any of the books that I read this month, aside from, of course, my book club pick, but I really enjoyed my reading month. It was a lot of unexpected books, a lot of books from different genres, and it was just very fun. So yeah, those were all of the books that I read. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, which I truly hope that you do, please consider subscribing to my account and following me on all of my social medias. I'm going to link everything in the description below. And also, let me know in the comments what was your favorite read of this month, because maybe you guys can give me some ideas of what I should read next month. I really hope to see you on my next video. Bye bye!